Okay, so we are live. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you can join us this evening for tonight's Facebook Live with Kim Barthel, Transitions, Making Change More Tolerable for Families. As a parent or caregiver, we all recognize the increase in stress that can be caused by transitions, whether that's just getting out the door to go to school or anywhere. Adjusting from elementary to high school, or maybe to a new country, or maybe there's been a loss in the family. When kids have differently wired brains or have experienced trauma in its many forms, these moments and stages in time often become significantly harder to navigate. So it's our hope that tonight's event will offer insights into why transitions can be challenging and how we can make them easier for everyone. My name is Chantal. I'm the Community Engagement Liaison with Adopt for Life. I am so very happy to be here tonight as facilitator for this webinar with Kim Barthel. Tonight, Kim has a short presentation ready. It's going to be about 30 minutes-ish. And then we can take breaks during that time to take any questions that you might have. And then, of course, we're going to just open the floor after that 30 minutes for probably gonna be like an hour where, I mean, what an amazing opportunity, learning experience. We're just gonna chat, have a great conversation. Some of you are familiar with our format of doing our Facebook Lives. I know that we have a lot of new faces joining us tonight, so welcome and thank you for coming. I'm just gonna take that opportunity to remind you that whatever you're sharing in the comments, it's going to be available publicly. So you just want to be mindful of what information you're putting into your questions, specifically if you're asking questions about a minor. So your name and health information, things like that, that you might not necessarily want to share or just be out there in the public. So just keep that in mind. We do want to hear from you, and we really, really hope that you find this discussion informative and engaging. So just bear with me. I know you're here to hear Kim and not me, but I just want to take a tiny moment to introduce Kim, because like I said, there might be people who aren't familiar with her. They could be watching from anywhere. So Kim Barthel is an award-winning occupational therapist, transdisciplinary teacher, and best-selling author who is actively supporting function and healing in many cultures. A pioneer in reinforcing the importance of relationship, Kim's passionate interests include complex behavior, attachment, sensory processing, trauma-informed practice, and mental health. Kim's mission is to support the conscious evolution of the human spirit. So with that, I'll ask everyone to give a warm, warm welcome to Kim. Absolute pleasure to have you with us, and really, really just looking forward to tonight. So thanks again, and I'm just gonna, hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chantal, for the warm welcome and the opportunity to have this conversation on Facebook Live this evening. It's interesting that here we are at the end of June, at a time when we usually think about, we're transitioning into summer break. And this past year and a half now has been so unusual that there are constant pivots, changes, alterations, that transitions have become an aspect of what's going to happen today when I wake up. So in this conversation tonight, we're going to explore what this idea of change does to the brain, does to our physiology, does to our behavior, and how as parents, teachers, caregivers, therapists, people in the community, we can support in these experiences. So I thought I'd get us started by just having a little bit of information to ground ourselves from. What's interesting when we think about a transition, what comes to mind for many parents are things like entering daycare, going to kindergarten, middle school, high school, college, that these are familiar transitions that we have in our minds. But a transition, in its true definition, is a passage from one state, one subject to another. There is moments of time in a day going from the bathroom to the kitchen, going from the house to the car, driving down the street in a different direction. These can be transitions that children and adults who experience neurodiversity or anxiety, that can cause a disruption in their experience. So it doesn't have to be events, it can be shifts in time. Many of the children that I have supported across many years have diagnoses like autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Many different labels are attached to them. But part of a challenge in neurodiversity is managing novelty. Novelty meaning change, that the brain is designed to notice any change for a warning of threat or danger. So that could be a change in the room. It could be a change from one place to another. And the brain stem will pick this up as information that shouts to the whole brain, something is different here. Pay attention. So we need to think about inherent in transitions and change is the brain's danger and warning system is online. And if I have a history of any kind of developmental trauma, any kind of wiring in my brain that causes me anxiety in relationship to potential changes in my life, I'm going to be activated in these experiences. And I think knowing that helps parents, hopefully helps parents, helps clinicians anticipate this kind of shift in the nervous system, rather than this belief or idea that the child might actually have some control over their responses. There is a very, very important differentiation here between the concept of change and a transition. So to me, from a psychotherapeutic perspective, change is a situation like moving of a house, retirement, changing a job, changing from one school to another school. Whereas a transition is the internal work that comes with that change. How that individual adapts, copes, has access to their resilience, and shifts with those changes. So the transition process is something that's happening inside. One of the most important concepts that we at Relationship Matters talk about every day is that regulation, this term, the ability to manage my emotions, my state, my way of being in the world, involves feeling my feelings, expressing my feelings, and then moving on from my feelings. And so often, what we want is for individuals to just move on from their feelings. And part of that learning of tolerance, that inner work of tolerating any kind of stress, means that I have to actually be able to land in my emotions and have them held, acknowledged by another person with me somewhere along the way in my life. And as I land there, I start to be able to feel those feelings safely in my own body and know I'm going to survive them. And this is the contribution of transitions for resilience, that we all need these, I call them bumping up against the edges, experiences that give us some adversity, that we bump up against the edges of our stress tolerance in order for us to expand those edges so that across our lifespan, we can hold space for ourselves with all of the different challenges that we will face in life. So transitions are part of this resilience building aspect of how we manage and navigate stress. There are going to be countless numbers of transitions that we experience across a lifetime. Some of them are small, we hardly remember them. And some of them are magnificent and wondrous, and some of them are terrible. We know they will happen, and we can't always control their happening. What we learn is how to respond to these transitions. And every single person is going to vary in their response. We will have as many different adaptive responses as we have the number of people on this planet. Now, many of you I know in the Adopt for Life community are thinking about kids who transitioned into your home, kids who transitioned into your family, kids who had experiences in their histories where transitions tip them towards adversity as opposed to towards resilience. One of the amazing things about the brain is its ability to rewire and repair. Sometimes this can happen quickly, and sometimes this takes years for that kind of shift to occur in the consciousness of each individual. I'm going to take a breath for a moment here and just check in with Chantal and see if anything interesting or curious is coming up in the conversation in the chat.
A lot of people that are just really excited to be here and just to be listening. I don't have any specific direct questions in terms of the material that you have presented so far. I think we're just all in rapture and listening to what you're saying.
Well, it's nice. I wish I could see you. I'm pretending that I can.
That's right. With the presentation, you can't see me. That's true.
So I'm pretending that you're right here with me and reaching into the camera with my energy as best of my capacity to connect in the way that I would love to be, as if we were in the same room together. When we think about how do we make a transition natural and smooth, one of the interesting aspects is that we will need to let go of the idea that it's going to ever be perfect or be right, that we will fumble through transitions, and that what really creates this term resilience is what we call repair. That when our children struggle with whatever it is that they're struggling with, if we shift with them into dysregulation, which I'm a parent. My daughter is now 25, but I have this in my history of my experience as well. If I joined my daughter into this space of stress and angst and fear, there's no anchor. There's no anchor for them. I'm remembering, I'm going to be vulnerable here and tell a story. I remember one time, my daughter, I hope she might even be listening, you never know, who had lice in her hair. She caught lice from another student at school, and she had hair all the way down past her waist. And this was a big deal in our house, doing hair every day. And I couldn't, as a parent, together with my husband, Bob, get rid of this lice. And one of my dearest friends is a hairstylist. And she said, Kim, I think we have to color it and we have to cut it. And for this being, my daughter, who'd had this hair all the way down past her waist for these 9 years of her life, this was a huge transition, a massive trauma. There was all kinds of emotion. It's interesting to think about cutting your hair as a trauma, but there was a lot of emotion invested in this process. And so we went, and she got to decide what style she wanted, were we going to add some color that was different than her own color. We tried to make this into the most positive transition possible. And, we talked it up. What are we going to wear? Trying to control the outcome. In the car on the way home from this experience, and by the way, her hair looks so cute, in my opinion, she lost it. Emotionally became completely dysregulated beyond anything I'd ever experienced. And she moved into this display of anger. And I don't remember exactly what the trigger was, but she kicked the back of the driver's seat. I was driving and she was sitting right behind me, and she kicked the car seat so hard that the seat came out of its bracket. It's still a trigger for me to tell this story. And I was shaking because we were on, a very busy road. And I was terrified and also angry. And I remember, this is not my finest parenting moment, pulling over to the side of the street, opening the door and saying, "Get out." I was so dysregulated. And I drove off because I was in the middle of the road and I had to pull in to the parking lot in order to turn around and come back. And she actually thought I had left her, that I just drove away, and there she was on the road. This was such a dramatic experience of joining her in her dysregulation. I remember actually, as a parent in this moment, dissociating. I was shaking because I really thought I was going to drive into another car. I felt unsafe. And I left my body for a few seconds. And I had to get myself organized again. And my urge was to separate. And this had never happened to me in any other experience that I'd had as a parent in that 9 years, where there was this level of intensity of fear and overwhelming emotion. I knew, as my cognitive brain started to come back on, which only took maybe a moment or so, And I pulled into the parking lot, turned around, and came right up beside her on the other side of the sidewalk. So I'm right behind her, and I opened the door, and we were both crying. And I put my arms out and I said, that was my worst parenting moment ever in my life. And she said, that was my worst kid moment ever in my life. And we just both cried. She was deeply sad at this transition. And both of us to this day would be able to tell that story as a place of repair in our relationship. That even though I sucked in my own opinion of how I handled that situation, I am able to compassionately say, I was doing the best that I could with what I had. And in the end, it gave us this intimacy of opportunity to connect in that completely discombobulated state. So why I'm sharing that story is we would like all these transitions to go smooth, but ultimately that's not what gives us this expansion in our skill set to tolerate changes in life. When we are thinking about strategies, given that, we're often looking at what can we control? What can we create to think ahead, to make transitions as ideal as possible? And one of the most important things is when we are giving our children over to someone else, like a summer camp or a new teacher or a Sunday school class or a babysitter. We have to have some trust. And this is not always easy because we bring in to those transitions our own history of what our own transitions were like. And that is what I call conscious parenting. Every time our children mark a transition in their lives, we do it with them from that same perspective of how it went for us when we were having those transitions ourselves. I remember the first day that my daughter went to kindergarten. I remembered my own first day of kindergarten, the day that she graduated, my own day of graduation. Every time there is a breakup in a relationship with a boyfriend, you walk through all these things with our children, and they bring us back to ourself. So part of holding space for our kids is becoming our best self. We want the people who care for our children to care for them the way that we do. We want teachers to be able to put their mind in the mind of my child. We advocate for our children. We explain our children. We hope that people will be willing to engage in relationships with our children in the way that we do. We want our kids to feel like, I like this term, like a fish in water, that they belong, that there is a community, a sense of openness, belonging. And belonging, by the way, we are talking so much right now around diversity and inclusion, that when the brain perceives that I am excluded, this is a form of trauma. And so belonging and feeling like I have a friend, or that there are people there who understand me in that space, that's going to create a sense of comfort and safety for me. To feel safe and to have unconditional acceptance. This term unconditional acceptance is maybe a wee bit of an illusion, that there isn't a true sense of unconditional acceptance, but there is a willingness that we can try to strive as adults, as parents, to be curious. Why is that child doing what they're doing? Why is that person doing what they're doing? Whether you're in the grocery store or the gas station, or if you're in a classroom. That particular curiosity moves us away from judgment into this open lens of wonder. And this is what we hope for our kids in their transitions, is that they will find beings that can give them the same sense that we hope that we can achieve in our family. Okay, Chantal, I'm checking in with you.
Okay, yeah, that's a good, resonating with a lot of people watching. There was a question, whether, I don't know whether you wanted to address it now or maybe it's going to come up later, but any kind of tips for, I guess that this person has multiple, like more than one child. And so, and they each have different transition needs. So, and sometimes they find themselves where they can't support all those needs at the same time. So what sort of tips would you have for a situation?
Beautiful question. And I would love to respond to that right here and now. One thing that is important to say about this idea of being able to take care of it all is that it's delusional. I say that with humor. It is impossible. It is impossible to hold in mind and have with you in attunement many beings at the same time. I say this often to teachers as well, who will often say to me when I'm talking about attachment and attunement and co-regulation, but I have 30 kids. And I will say, it's okay. You might have one child over here who you nod at them, you smile at them, you gaze at them, and that nonverbal cue arms them, that child, with oxytocin, with dopamine, with serotonin. These are chemistry of feeling good. And they can hold that in their body, in their brain, sometimes even in kindergarten, for 20 minutes. And they can stay grounded, and they're with you, and they feel comfortable in their independence. And you might have another child over here who that's not going to be sufficient. That level of attunement is not going to meet the threshold of their brain and body's need. So you might have to sit closer to them. You might have to lean towards them. You might have to have them on your lap. You might have to talk to them in a sideways way, like, I'm still here. I'm with you. I haven't forgotten that you're here. You may have different dosages of attunement for your different children. And ultimately, you have to be compassionate with yourself. How exhausting that is to try to be able to attune to different needs at the same time, that ultimately, when we lengthen that period of time of attunement between us and a child, we are allowing them to broaden their own window of tolerance. It's like they learn to stay in themselves increasing amounts of time, across time, for self-regulation, decreasing the amount of co-regulation. So instead of feeling guilty, which I know comes synonymously with the term parent, instead of moving into guilt, if we have, as caregivers, can remind ourselves, I'm doing the best that I can with what I have. And I still have tomorrow and the next day and the next day. That those waves that you see in these images, those are the returning repairs that are going to go on across time. I will never forget another example in my parenting journey as a child. So in this example, I'm a child and I'm thinking about my dad. And this was an example of that question. How do I attune to more than one child at a time? So I have a sister. She is 8 years younger than me. And my dad, he had just finished building this is many, now I'm going to tell you how old I am, a lamp out of styrofoam cups. Those of you who were, a teenager in the 70s, you might remember that kind of thing. So my dad this was his hobby. He'd made this huge lamp with these styrofoam cups. And it was something that he was very proud of. And my sister, who was about 3 or 4, she destroyed it. And my dad had the flu at the time, because I remember it was summer and he had on a big, thick wool sweater. This is an example of how we code information in a trauma. You remember weird details like that. What were they wearing? What was a smell? What was a sound? And my sister blamed this broken lamp on me. So she told my dad, Kim destroyed your lamp. And he took that information at face value. And I would have been about 10 or 11, around there. And he came into my room and I'm just like reading a book. And he actually smacked me for the first time in my entire life. And I was stunned. Like, what just happened? And I started to cry and he left the room. He slammed the door. And about 5 minutes later, he came back in and he had tears running down his face. And this is the part I will never forget. He said, I am so sorry that just happened. He said, I don't want to use that I'm not feeling well as an excuse, but I was only paying attention to one of you at a time. And I realize that it's hard to have your mind in both minds. And because I thought your sister was little, I didn't think she was capable of that. And now I feel really sad. And I want you to know that I trust you. That was a game changer for me. So I am more connected to the repair than I am to the injury. And that is the important aspect here of any time we have to do anything, is this belief that we are going to mess up and that there is always the opportunity to reconnect in the next moment or the next moment. Anything else in there, Chantal, at this moment?
Not specifically, just thanking you for answering that question, and just the comment about being compassionate with yourself really resonating with a lot of people. So I think that usually means it's always a good reminder. People need to hear that
Yes.
a lot.
There is a challenge that Kim has with the word strategy, just to be honest, because the word strategy is often like a toolbox or a course of action that I should do in order to have a particular outcome. At least that's what the word strategy means to me. And what is so deeply challenging about relationships is that strategies really aren't the answer. In my experience, what really brings us into security is being aware of myself and being attuned to the other. And this is hard. Having my mind in my own mind and having my curiosity in the other. And this is a skill set that takes many, many years, I'm still working on it, to develop, where I am asking myself questions. Wow, what was it about that experience that I just had, whatever it is, that made me, and I use the word activated, stressed, uncomfortable, anxious, angry, sad, fearful, joyful. It's this mindful observation of myself that allows me to know myself, that gives that sense of, I know what's going to trigger me in different contexts. And when I can start to have that level of self-awareness, I become more capable of realizing, this is a powerful thing, I think, that it's never really about the other person. That when I am triggered, activated, or stressed, that whatever is happening out here, outside of me, is like a reflection of what's happening in here, inside of me. And that nothing will trigger us more than our children, because very little matters more than our children. And in this conscious parenting journey, we have this continuous opportunity for self-reflection, for awareness of, why am I feeling this way? And when we come from that space and we no longer personalize the behavior of the other person to the same extent, and we are able to create this space between us that stops me from reacting and allows me to respond. If I know this is mine, then I move away from blame and shame and anger and frustration at the other. And it allows me to pause and respond with curiosity, as opposed to, why are you doing that to me? Because that's how it feels like. So in this process of transitions, we have enhanced disruptions, potential for disruptions in our relationship with our children, because there's more stress during a transition. And so our parenting opportunities for consciousness, they're bigger in those moments. And I think that with this idea of holding on to myself or understanding myself, as I move towards this era, I think, of grandparenting, maybe someday, it's easier as you have more experience. But it's that internal curiosity that allows us to pause and respond instead of react. Many children who come into adoption, who come into care of any kind, they have a history that they bring with them. A history, and what's interesting about this word history is not always remembered consciously. That when we think about how the brain is designed, it's wired for love and connection because our survival depends on it. When you are a fetus in utero, when you are a baby developing in your mom's tummy, whatever your mom is experiencing in that period of your development is coded in your nervous system, in your genes, in your structures of your body, for better and for worse. We bring it's unavoidable. We bring our history into being with us. And if my early life was predominantly, I'm very careful about my words because there isn't a single one of us who has a child, is pregnant for 9 months, and doesn't have some stress. Again, that's just an impossibility. But if my level of chaos, of anxiety, of trauma, let's say I'm experiencing domestic violence, let's say I am homeless, let's say I live in poverty, let's say I just lost my parent, let's say I just lost my partner. These might be examples of stress that moves towards trauma that impact mom's chemistry and impact baby's chemistry. One of the most profound pieces of work that I am highly influenced by is the work of Dr. Rachel Yehuda and all of her love of intergenerational, transgenerational transmission of trauma. And she has studied both Holocaust survivors as well as moms who were pregnant in the building of the World Trade Centers during 9/11. And she looked at, in her work, DNA. What happens to the DNA of us when we are exposed to trauma in early life? And early life, in her definition, is 0 to 5. And especially in the neurobiology of trauma, the field that I work in 0 to 2. The younger you are, when you are exposed to loss, separation, chaos, trauma, neglect, unavailable caregiving, for whatever reason, it's not about blame. The nervous system, which is growing so rapidly during that period of time, shapes around those experiences and becomes hypersensitive to danger, to survival. And what Dr. Yehuda discovered was in her post-Holocaust survivors, trying to get that out of my mouth, is that children who were in the prisoner of war camps, separated from their parents, as they were under the age of 5, they had tremendous changes in their DNA. That their DNA, the part of us in our cells that continues to replicate day after day, the part of the DNA that is responsible for managing stress changed. That those early exposures to danger had an impact on the cells in the body as they managed the stress response. And so her Holocaust survivors were less capable of coping with day-to-day stressors in their lives at a cellular level. And what she found in her research was second, third, and fourth generation, that's the data she has to this day, as far as I understand it, that demonstrated transmission of the same lineage of struggle across generations, even though that was no longer the fourth generation's day-to-day life. That this, who knew that what happened to my grandparents and great-grandparents is part of what I carry in my cells. I promise you I'm going to tell you something positive in a moment. This is the hard part to hear. In the work of the 9/11 study, as my interpretation of it, is moms who were traumatized, had post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being in the World Trade Centers and surviving. That their DNA showed this same form of change. Sometimes in science, we call it the post-traumatic stress disorder signature in the DNA. And when the babies were born to these moms that struggled in this PTSD experience of 9/11, they were born with this same signature in their cells. That it reinforces that what's happening to moms is happening to babies. Recently had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Yehuda talk about that this is not all doom and gloom. And she recited a study about mice. Can't remember if it was mice or rats, but one of those two. And when we want to understand the human brain, we use mice and rats because we're not that different. It's kind of strange to say that about our DNA and our brains. And what they found in an experiment was mice who were delivered with electric shocks, isn't that horrible? And paired that with the smell of cherry blossoms. So trauma and smell, trauma and smell. Cherry blossoms are generally positive in smell, but they conditioned these mice to find this smell aversive because of the emotional trauma that came with it. And what they found was these mice, when they produced offspring, those offspring found the smell of cherry blossoms aversive in the absence of the electrical shock. That the babies of this original cohort, they learned that this is something to fear. Not because I learned it directly, but because it was coded in the DNA. What was so powerful about this study is they found that it can be reversed. That this original cohort that was found to be traumatized with these cherry blossoms, it could be undone. That I could reverse the fear, and find the smell of cherry blossoms to be okay. And this is true in humans, that even though we may have a history of trauma and suffering, that if we transition in our inner work, we can change our DNA, and then we don't pass it on to the next generation. It can stop with me. So remember those mice whose parents were fearful of cherry blossoms, and that they could change their response and not continue to pass that on to the next generation. So often, the reason this is important is kids come into our care and we may say, but I got you at birth. You came into my life at birth. How is it that this is challenging? Well, this piece of information may help us to appreciate the bigger picture that comes with prenatal experiences as imprints. I'm finding as I'm talking, it's really strange to talk to yourself. And, I'm so used to having at least many yellow boxes in front of me who look at me with a face like, that wasn't quite clear, or, wow, I get it. But in this situation, it's not quite the same. So I'm going to pause for a moment and ask if anyone needs any clarity on what I've just said.
I think that's a good idea. I'll let you know. So if anybody wants further clarification on that, because I think it's really fascinating, the research. People have asked for the doctor's name. So I was just looking it up as you were talking, but somebody beat me to it and put the link to some of the research that she's been doing, which is fascinating. And also fascinating that she found that it can be reversed or stopped or not passed on.
Exactly. And that's the hope, hey?
Right.
That's the whole point of this workshop or this conversation tonight, is to provide that hope and that inspiration that just because it's challenging doesn't mean that that's our destiny.
So there is a question whether this coding, can this coding lead to diagnosis that could be misplaced, like a misplaced diagnosis, I guess. And really that's just their DNA coding, and it's interpreted as a disorder, and then they get labeled with a diagnosis that might not be the case.
That is such a powerful and tender question, because from my perspective, as I view humans, I see them in such a holistic way. And when I look at the way that we diagnose behavior, and then I look at the brain research behind those diagnoses, so many of the same brain parts are involved in multiple labels, including developmental trauma, including childhood adversity, including prenatal exposure to stress. That the brain, it's the same brain, and that the brain, as it's developing, maybe it came from the direction of a genetic influence. Maybe the development of that being came from a interface with a virus or a toxin. Maybe it came from a stressor. The contributing factors to the development of who we are is made up of so many different spokes on a bicycle wheel that it is really, truly difficult to know where things came from and why they fell out the way that they did. And until in medicine becomes individualized, sometimes I think it's going to happen. We are doing the best we can with what we have to try and respond through this looks like that. You know, this looks like autism, or this looks like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And as many of you know, as parents, a lot of times it's a mixed up soup of multiple variables. I happened to attend a conference many years ago now at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. And this was a conference around research in mental health and the Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5, which is how we make diagnoses. And I don't say we because I'm not one of the people who does that. As an OT, physicians and psychologists and individuals who study and come to that place of identification of developmental challenges, that the president of the National Institute of Mental Health said, I challenge all of you out there to do better than making a diagnosis based upon what you see in behavior. I challenge you to understand what's happening in the neurobiology. I challenge you to understand what's happening in the epigenetics. I challenge you to look at the context that that person comes from, the culture. I challenge you to look at their hormones. I challenge you to look at their gut. I challenge you to look at their immune system. That we are, and that's just a few examples, an interaction of variables, and that they interface with each other. So this conversation around diagnoses is a tricky one, because often it's a pathway in. But for me, when it's an end point, as the way it dictates our interventions, that's not good enough for me. That there is so many different lenses that I need to think about when I am being curious about the individual in front of me, that the diagnosis that's on the piece of paper doesn't tell me what I'm going to do. It's not enough. I need to know the person in front of my nose when I think about how best can I support you as a person. So that was a very long way of getting around the question of saying that, yes, there are multiple paths to disruption in brain parts that can look very similar in diagnostic pictures.
Thanks, Kim. I like your roundabout answers. I learned so much from them. So we have a few questions rolling in. So I just want to ask, I'll just say, to everyone, thank you for your patience, because I know everybody wants their question asked, and we're doing the best we can. So I'll just start with a comment first, Kim, about just appreciating the hopefulness around the idea that that parents or caregivers can help their kids reverse the impact of that earlier trauma. So just appreciating that insight. And then there was another person who had more specific question about so maybe going back to the research, or how is it applied in real life? Like, what is done to actually reverse the effect of those traumatizing stimuli? Like, what approach?
Here we go.
Segue.
Perfect. What does attachment have to do with transitions? When you look at this image, these two beings look like mirrors of each other, right? They have their mind in each other's minds. And this is not only an emotional experience, it's a neurobiological experience. And what you see here in this example is mutual delight. And what the parent's brain is saying to the child's brain is, I delight in you. I love you. You are the most important thing to me in the world in this moment. And what that does is ignite a circuit in the brain that is the CEO of regulation. To me, this is incredible. The CEO, meaning, the chief executive officer, the supervisor of the whole brain, the part of your brain that pays attention, the part of your brain that has working memory, predicts the future, looks back at the past, that has this capacity to make decisions. The part of your brain that stops you from hitting your boss at a staff meeting. This is the CEO of your brain. And it is ignited, lit up, activated through this dyadic, meaning two people, serve and return, that goes on between parents and children. It's like when you have a newborn baby and you pick up that baby and you go, ah! And you have this, it's just so natural. You can't help it in yourself. And that in your nonverbal cues, your eyes are open, your face communicates naturally this sense of love. And what that does is it's received by the brain as an oxytocin activator. And that chemical, oxytocin, I'm going to move here for a second and show you what it looks like. I'll come back in a moment here. This is the chemical of oxytocin, the chemistry of love. And this is our number one stress relief chemical across our lifespan. That are the antidote to stress is oxytocin. Whenever we feel across our lifespan, from birth to elderly states, when we feel dysregulated, stressed, sad, uncomfortable, the touch of a hand, holding a hand, a smile, a right head tilt, tilting your head to the right, a lean in. This accesses that circuitry. And what it does is it immediately dials down all the chemicals floating around of adrenaline and cortisol and makes you feel safe. The thing about coming into a family with a history of being unsafe is you're not necessarily going to recognize safety right away. If my brain formulated around, hey, there's no oxytocin, there's just stress chemistry here, and I don't have that soothing experience in my body, it didn't happen in this context, then it's not going to be recognizable. And I'm going to have to practice moments and moments of time across time. It makes me think about right now, my very first experience, speaking of developmental trauma, of working in orphanages in Eastern Europe. The very first time I walked in to this orphanage, where I was sent to teach the caregivers in this orphanage how to help children with cerebral palsy move their bodies. So my job was very clear that Kim, you as a therapist specializing in movement, are going to teach movement to this caregiver. Caregivers was my anticipation. And I was there for 3 months. And I walk into this orphanage, and there were 60 children in one room with one caregiver. And there was no way I was going to be able to teach that one caregiver how to support the motor skills of 60 children. It was like somebody hit me with a frying pan across the head when I first walked in the door. And what was so startling for me in that environment was the silence. If you can imagine 60 children in one space, and there was no sound. They were from, 6 months of age about to about 8. And nobody made a sound. And I, in that time, this is way back in the 90s, didn't know anything about attachment. Didn't know anything about stress and trauma. And I started picking kids up. I was here for 3 months. So I'm going to do the treatment myself, is what I thought. And as I started to pick kids up, guess what happened? They started to scream. They started to rage. They started to weep. And my instinct was, you've just done something horrible here. You've created absolute chaos. And then what I realized is I was actually teaching them to soothe. That those expressions had been suppressed, had not ever been addressed. It's part of typical development to be hungry, to be in pain, to be lonely, to be seeking connection. And when those needs are interrupted, the brain expresses that through crying, through anger, through depression. Babies can be depressed. And as we express those emotions, that's where soothing, the oxytocin dosage, shifts it and goes, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So in my 3-month experience, for the first, 2 months at least, it was just awful. And then you started to see little bits of light bulbs come on in the eyes. And that access to the connection was there. So in response to that question, that was an extreme example I just gave you. Many of you will have adopted or foster cared or have your own children who may not come from that level of stress and trauma, or they may. But the formula is the same. The formula is to meet the child where they are at. And I think if I had a wish for every parent who adopts or who fosters, is to give them the knowing that they are stepping into a world with this child that they are bringing into their family, of adventure, of attunement. And that attunement means it's going to be messy. And that it's likely to be messy, and that I'm going to learn to dance with this child and see that love is enough, but love isn't enough. That the attunement is the path to love. Oh, you're really sad right now. Oh, you really don't want to eat that food right now. Ah, you're telling me, I think about my daughter kicking the back of the car seat. If I had my cortex available to me in that moment, I would have said, it does really suck. We just cut off this much of your hair. I'm so sorry. I understand how mad you are. Right? That's the dance that changes the way you self-protect. Chantal, I'm sure there's something to say in response to that.
There is, but there were questions earlier, and I don't want to miss those, because this is going still back to when you were talking about the research and the DNA and the trauma. And so, that brought up a lot of questions for a lot of people watching. And so one of them is there a difference in terms of the effects of the trauma on the DNA, whether a child is adopted at a younger age as opposed to an older age, or does that make a difference in the response or in the amount of reversal that can happen?
So the answer is we don't know. But in Dr. Yehuda's study, remember her original generation that was in the prisoner of war camp and their offspring. The offspring didn't have the experience of the prisoner of war camp. And yet they still had it in their DNA. And why I'm saying that right here is to remind us that there are so many aspects that each one of us brings to life that we have absolutely zero knowledge or control over. Right? That I think about my own ancestry connected to World War II and pieces of that are in me that I don't know, but I know in my body. And so it broadens that umbrella out. The intention of that knowledge is to broaden that umbrella out to increase our compassion, that we might not have all the information ever, and to stay out of that fix-it mode. This is why I say I don't like the word strategies, because fixing it is what we want to do. And really reorganizing our history, our developmental traumas, each and every one of us, is a journey. It's a process. I'm thinking about something I heard Dr. Gabor Mate say just recently, is he said, trauma is not the things that happen to us. Trauma is the loneliness that we feel when we are alone with the feelings of what happened to us. And what that means is, it's not the experience, it's the relationship loss or lack of availability, or that is the trauma. When there isn't somebody there that has our back, that understands. So the question of when and how, and that's impossible to answer. And, when you think about the number of children that are adopted at birth, for example, and the trajectory of their experience is cool, relatively cool. And then you have a kiddo that is developed at 8, and the trajectory of their development is relatively cool. Then you have another child who is adopted at birth, and the whole journey is full of challenge. So there's no kind of sense of X equals Y. And that's the part that is so hard, is to be with what is, the alignment of being with what is. And how do I step into the journey that I'm having?
Okay, that was amazing, really powerful, like that. So many people were like, aha moment. That's like, somebody asked if you could talk a bit about attachment and FASD.
Sure.
And how those can add a layer, another additional layer to work through.
Absolutely. Oh, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is another soup of who knows what the heck that actually means from the perspective of the brain. Yesterday, I found myself talking about a blender as an analogy of, I put in all these different variables and I stick it in a blender and it becomes this individual concoction. Prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol creates an individualized outcome for every single person with that label. Every single person who experiences prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol, or as my friend Theo Fleury would say, prenatal exposure to pharmaceuticals. And that's his experience as a developing baby. That what the outcome is completely unique. And thus, sometimes the attachment system is affected and sometimes it isn't. But often, areas of the brain that are vulnerable, so let's talk about it this way, areas of the brain that are vulnerable to prenatal exposure are the areas of the attachment circuit. So it is common to find individuals with that diagnosis of prenatal exposure. If we looked at their brains, many of them have interferences in the circuitry that goes into this serve and return of this image that you're looking at in this mom and this kiddo, where sometimes that delight, that love, that connection, it doesn't land in the receiving child's brain with the same intensity, or it doesn't meet that individual brain's threshold. Some of you know firsthand that the dosage of attachment might be so intense in order for that brain to register that information. And so you can, in the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder brain, need to remember that you are the external brain. I'll never forget listening to my colleague, Dr. Nathan Ori, use that term, the external brain. And he said, when there's damage in the cognition, in the CEO of the brain, then someone else has to do that job for you. And that can be exhausting, can be absolutely exhausting. And what happens to many caregivers is that they are frustrated with the fact that it doesn't change. That sometimes that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder brain, it's wired so adversely that you have to work around the damage rather than try to build in that particular area that is damaged. I tried to say that as diplomatically as I could. And that working around means, in my experience with some of the adults that I've By the way, I've been in this field for 37 years. So some of the kids that I treat are now in their 30, they're 35 and or so. And some of them are very competent and do even better when they continue to have their external brain. Someone who's co-regulating them. So I think that's important to keep in mind is, you know, that circuitry is vulnerable to insult from prenatal exposure, and it can change the dance of attachment. I hope that was clear.
That was great, Kim. Thanks. I just want to be conscious of the time. So we have like probably 10 minutes left. So if you want to, if there's part of this that you really want to get across, then I'll let you go ahead and do that. And then we'll see where we're at time-wise.
Beautiful, because we've woven so many questions into this conversation.
Agreed. Agreed.
I just want to talk about separation, because inherent in transition is separation. And what is interesting about the brain is it doesn't like it. No one's brain likes the feeling of transitions away from. Many of us as adults, what we learn is to carry those people with us in our head. It's like, okay, I can leave my husband and go to work today, for example, because he's still there in my consciousness. Children can't do that. When you're gone out the window, or when you leave the room and go to the bathroom to take a shower, they think you're gone. Their object permanence is not developed sufficiently to hold you in mind. And what we know about that is that that's perceived as pain in the brain. That separation, especially when it's unwanted, that it hurts. And it doesn't just hurt emotionally, it hurts physically. And that's why it needs oxytocin, because oxytocin is an opiate that soothes pain. So remember that when we want to help our children have smooth transitions, the key is relationship. Relationship with other children, relationship with another adult, and coming back into relationship with us. So what helps at any age? Having somebody just delight in your arrival, being treated with respect, having time to settle in, feeling safe, given control. You have to have some control. Having realistic expectations, feeling valued. Routines. Oh my gosh. Routines and structure can be a lifeline, especially in a transition, that it helps us have some sense of something to hang on to that we can control. And, you know, anybody who is a teacher, an educator, these are things that are embodied in that first couple days at school, for example. What are the routines in this classroom? That's part of what we hope will happen. Soothing. When someone does struggle with a transition, instead of dismissing their experience, to remember to validate it. It's a very, very important strategy. And this is done in this way. Just look at that. I'm interested in you. I'm with you. I'm attuned to you, feeling of co-regulation. All the things I've already said. Putting your mind in the mind of the child in front of you. Oh, you look so sad. Let me give you a hug. Right? Not, come on, get on with it. And although we have moments like that, and lots of times I have those thoughts in my own head, it's that pause of saying, I get it. I get you're not comfortable here right now. And in any time that you're the receiver of a child in your setting that's making a transition, take the time to have a relationship. Give lots of opportunity for visits to your setting. Know that family. If you're the parent, tell about your family. Help that receiver of your child know what's important to your child. What are they interested in? What do they like? Ultimately, none of what I've said today is possible unless we have compassion for ourselves as caregivers and parents. I think my biggest takeaway message for you is remember this parenting experience is a journey, and that healing is being in alignment with what is and staying connected to the idea that change is always possible. This is what it is right now, and there's always hope for more. And that's a tension, and that keeps me in a balance. And sometimes that goes back and forth, day to day, moment to moment, year to year. And that it's about taking care of ourselves in this journey of being a parent. So Chantal, I am open to some more questions and comments before our time is up.
Excellent, because we do have a couple and we still have a few minutes left. So I think that's excellent timing. So somebody asked, and as a parent of multiple children with special needs, they often feel guilty for taking that time, that respite, that self-care time, because often it will trigger the children's sense of loss. And then it's like this sort of vicious cycle that ensues. So any suggestions on how to ease that for everybody, for the whole family? Somebody recommended Building Bridges from Dr. Feld. I wondered if you had another suggestion for this person's question.
When I think about this idea of guilt and causing disruption, dysregulation, taking care of myself so that I can step in, and minimizing the dysregulation for my child, it's this middle ground of what Dr. Daniel Siegel calls making sense out of things. The more we narrate our experience, and I mean, narration for me is something, it doesn't matter if you understand the words. I used to narrate to the preemies in the intensive care nursery. I'd stick my hands in the isolette and I would say, oh, your body is so relaxed. The nurses would think, there's something wrong with this therapist. It's the nonverbals of narration. I am going to whatever. I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee for half an hour. I know it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard on me. It's going to be hard on you. And I'm going to be back over and over and over and over again. That in that narration, you're speaking both to yourself and to the child, and learning to tolerate their distress without feeling responsible for it. Talk about the hardest work of being a parent. And you asked me for a resource, and I didn't catch what you said. Something about, yeah?
Yeah, it wasn't you I was asking. It was interesting because when that person asked that question, someone else gave them a resource to a doctor. Just got to go find it now. It's like buried in all the comments. Anyway, I thought that was interesting just to get a different perspective.
I'm thinking about, something that I don't like to do, and that's talk about conversations with a rattlesnake. So this is a book that I wrote with former NHL hockey player Theo Fleury. And you know what? It's a really, really powerful experience of understanding developmental trauma as a lived experience and the process of repair. So I'm just going to shout out to the book that it really,
I can put I can post a link to it in the chat too after.
And it really gives people a sense of understanding.
That's wonderful. A lot of people sending you their thanks, extending their gratitude, appreciation for all your insights, your knowledge, your experience. If you had a question that we didn't get to, I apologize. We'll do our best to get to them maybe after the fact. If you started watching this maybe midway through, I would recommend we're just watching this on replay, because there's a good chance that Kim maybe already addressed, maybe possibly. So I would start there, watch it on replay. And then if you still feel like your question wasn't answered, then just pop it back into the comments. I'm just going to echo everybody's sentiment and just say thank you so much, Kim, for being with us tonight, sharing your stories, sharing your expertise, sharing your time. It is so appreciated. I also want to thank everybody who watched tonight live and engaged with us with your questions and your comments. And it just provided such a rich discussion. So I'm really thankful for that. And if you're watching this later on replay, well, I appreciate you too. So thank you for that. Kim, if you are registered as a parent or a caregiver in our Adopt for Life's Parent to Parent program, you know that Kim is coming back for Becoming a Behavioral Detective. Part 3 is in 2 weeks on June 29th. So you have plenty of time to register. So I just thought I'd just throw that out there as a quick reminder. Thank you, Kim. I'm wishing you all a very good night and to take care of yourselves.
Thank you, everyone. It was a delight to be with you virtually this evening.
It's the best we can do in these times, right? All right, take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.